So when the Soviets took over, again, it was very vague. Their agenda was very clear and simple and attractive, but false. They didn't really believe those things. They said nothing about the church, or nothing about what they were going to do, the camps or anything else. You don't go on the campaign trail talking like that. And at the time, the only people who refused to recognize it were the Cossacks. They saw that, they saw what the trick that was being played on them, and the Cossacks were the kind of the bridgeheads for the white formations. The Bolsheviks were not very strong. They were just rich, and they had international contacts everywhere. So the elections came, Constituent Assembly, only about 50% of the population voted. Because right-wing parties weren't allowed to compete. But even with that, even with a tightly controlled election, the Bolsheviks only got 23.9% of the vote. Socialist Revolutionaries got 40%, Mensheviks 2.3%, Cadets 4.7%, and other parties got 29.1%. And of course, Chernin became the chairman of the assembly. So you see that all comes to 100% exactly. And Chernov became the head of the assembly. So even in a controlled election, they couldn't win. But in Petrograd and Moscow, you had demonstrations held in support of the Constituent Assembly. This was what the moderate revolutionaries were going to rally around. The Bolsheviks wanted nothing to do with this, partially because they lost, and partially because it got in the way. This is where you have labor rebellions against the Reds. And the rallies, which is almost all labor, in favor of the assembly were shot by the Red Guards in huge numbers. And even Gorky he wrote, "No matter how much Pravda might lie about this, it will not hide this shameful fact." So their first massacre was to those defending the Constituent Assembly. So they dispersed the assembly, of course, as well as everyone supporting it. And that's when Lenin's hands were completely untied. That's when the Cheka was created. And February 21st, 1918, they received the right to kill people. And the phrase was the right to direct reprisal against active counter-revolutionaries. And that include, quote, speculators, thugs, and hooligans. In other words, anybody. And that became the implementation of Marxist ideas. The 7th Congress of the party was in March 1918, and they were called the Russian Communist Party Bolsheviks. But the more their agenda was promoted, which of course was not, anyone didn't even realize this was the agenda, resistance developed everywhere. November 1917, a decree on production over all factories called the Red Guard attack on capital. All plants, factories, workshops, retailers, bakeries, everything were confiscated, which now then were owned by party members, and became the personal property of Lenin and his friends. The banking system collapsed, which is actually nothing interesting. It collapsed in many places at the time. And all that money was lost. Gold and jewelry were all confiscated. Factories stopped. Commodity prices went through the roof. Salaries were not paid, and money became worthless. The economy collapsed entirely. None of these guys were economists. None of these guys were workers. None of these guys really were anything. They were professional Jewish revolutionaries. They had no idea what they were doing, but they did know that in confiscating these places and claiming that they're expropriating them, they became the wealthiest people on the planet. So on March 26, 1918, the extraordinary meeting of the authorized factories and plants in Petrograd, this is a group of workers, says, "We, Petrograd workers, have for the most part accepted this October Revolution, committed on our behalf and without our participation. But 4 months have already passed, and we see our faith is cruelly shamed, our hopes grossly crushed. The new government calls itself Soviet and labor-based, peasant, but in reality, the most important issues of state life are resolved solely by party members." Lenin immediately starts screaming anti-Semitism. Because, of course, we all know what they were talking about. They come right out and say that workers had nothing to do with any of this stuff. They're saying, we're workers. No one told us about this. Workers actually became empowered at this point, and to a man, they were violently opposed to the Reds. The All Russian Congress in July of 1918, this is like, a labor movement said, the experiments of socializing and nationalizing factories must be stopped. The proletariat can and must coordinate its activities with the efforts of other progressive classes interested in developing productive forces. The main task of the working class politically today is the struggle for the overthrow of Soviet power and the restoration of a democratic system. This was in the Baltics, and they were immediately arrested by the Latvian Red Guards. 1918, the doctors, professionals, everyone in the All-Union Congress of Engineers went on strike in Moscow, St. Petersburg, elsewhere. Transport, power plants, educational institutions did not function. And then that's where forced labor began. They could not restore the economy, but that's where it began. The volume of industrial production steadily declined. It was about maybe 5% of the 1913 level in 1920. Lenin said, these 3.5 years meant for the working class, for the proletariat, such disasters, such deprivations, such sacrifices, such an exacerbation of all kinds of needs never before seen in the world. Workers were rebelling all over the place. In Volkinsk, 1918, workers overthrew the local Soviet and created the Izhevsk People's Army. It was about 70,000 men. For about 100 days, they fought the Reds. But they were forced to retreat east. They joined the White Army of Kolchak. Actually became an elite force within Kolchak's army. You ain't going to read about that anywhere. And the peasantry, needless to say, were in constant revolt. They ended up giving, the land that they actually gave ended up being about, minimal. A few square feet a person. Remember, these landlords were peasants. The peasantry controlled 95% of the land by the time World War I started, either through communes or by themselves. The nobility was gone. This was, these weren't rich men, but in their politics, the Reds were talking about these, wealthy landlords that existed in Great Britain, but did not exist in Russia at the time. But they existed in Russia, but they did not own, they didn't have the power or ownership that they had elsewhere. The land problem had been solved. And if you wanted more, free land was available with free implements and seed and everything else in Siberia if you were willing to move there. The peasantry was not opposed to monarchy. So they pretended to want to give land to peasantry. They did a few very symbolic moves to that end, and of course, very soon it was collectivized. All land was declared state property by the decree on land. And peasants received it as renters. So the jig was up, with the bait and switch, because the Reds were saying that we're going to redistribute land to you, i.e. private property. This is what was said in the West. All political parties were saying this is what they were going to do. You'll see it in textbooks today. Despite the fact that they know that it never happened, they'll say this is what they wanted. And you see how they're claiming to be the working class. None of these people were actually working class, but they claim to be. And of course, now you have massive shortages that are developing. Already in November of 1917, as always, the Reds created bread detachments. This is their knowledge of economics. So they just created a militia and went into the countryside and stole as much grain as they could. And it became the Food and Requisition Army. And the force by 1918 was about 42,000. So another order was issued, the forced surrender of surplus food, so to speak. Surplus food. Private trade was immediately declared a crime and punishable by death, like everything was. And there were outposts everywhere, so no one could walk or drive with any food. Everyone was put on rations by the Red government. Now, Russia was feeding the planet in 1913. The Midwestern United States and Russia were feeding the entire world. And now But the summer of 1918, you have widespread starvation. Now, the Reds don't know anything about agriculture. They know nothing about economics. They don't know anything about industry. Everything was just creating an army and sending them out to steal whatever they needed. Lenin says, the task of combating hunger is not only pumping bread out of the grain-growing areas, but also filling and collecting all surplus bread to the state's reserves, as well as all food products in general. Having not achieved this, one cannot decisively secure any socialist transformation, because having distributed it all correctly, we will dominate all areas of labor. You know, it's not like this stuff is secret. The absurdity that somehow Stalin was the problem, that he created this tyrannical state, the point of which is to say that Lenin and Trotsky were good guys, and they do. Most professors will tell you that. And he's coming out and saying, of course, we failed completely economically. We don't know what we're doing. But if we control food, we control the entire country. This is how they were securing their domination. And because it's so evil and Machiavellian that most other groups didn't even think in these terms. Whenever there was a problem, Lenin and Trotsky, Zinoviev, these guys created a military detachment to deal with it by force. And the food detachments were the food requisition army, were given full authority to take hostages, which is one of the ways that they functioned, and shoot resistors. Hostages was one of the main ways that they secured rule in the countryside. Lenin authorized the commissioner, this is his note to the commissioner in Saratov, to shoot conspirators and the hesitant without asking anyone and not allowing idiotic red tape. In other words, there's not going to be any law here at all. The chairman of the Penza Provisional Committee, Manikin, Lenin says this: hang. Well, these actually are numbered. Number 1, hang, certainly hang, so that people can see at least 100 notorious kulaks, rich men, bloodsuckers. Number 2, post their names. Number 3, take away all bread from them. Number 4, appoint hostages. Wire receipt and execution. Now, by rich kulaks, you're talking about what we would call lower middle class peasants with yeoman farmers. So he created then in June of 1918 committees of the poor, created in villages. The committee of the poor were given the right to confiscate food. Now these committees of the poor were those who had nothing in the villages. They were often mentally ill, or criminals, or simply were not very good at what they did. That's why they were being cared for by the village commune. Lenin knew this, and so in giving them legal power, he then opened up the prisons and the institutions, such as they were, and said, now you have the right to arrest and destroy whatever you want. Which is, this is to live through this dystopia is unbelievable. So then, if that's not enough, Lenin demanded that massive labor armies be formed by peasants to protect the gains of the revolution, as he says. According to the Cheka in 1918, after the surplus order was issued, a note from them says, only 245 major counter-revolutionary demonstrations were recorded in only 20 provinces of central Russia. Only 245 major demonstrations. In other words, we're killing enough of them that only 245, and just in central Russia, and just in 1 year. They're thinking, if we're making gains here, April of 1918, the entire Don region revolts, the Don River. In 1919, the entire Volga region. The Red Army in March of 1919 refused to shoot peasants in Polisia, and they sided with the rebels. And they captured places like Gomel. 1921, peasant rebels in Siberia occupied Kochkov, most of Tyumen, Omsk, and almost most of the provinces out there. And they laid siege to Ishim and other regions. These are not white forces. and the most prolonged crisis, the uprising of 1920-21 in the Tambov region under Antonov, who created 3 armies of more than 50,000 men. And the Soviet encyclopedia says it can be said with certainty that there was not a single province, not a single county, where revolts of the kulaks, wealthy peasants, and middle peasants would not take place. Well, they defined wealthy peasant by anyone who was involved in these revolts. So this is not an economic category. So by the beginning of 1919, you have an economy in the advanced stages of total collapse. You had a worthless currency. You had no food. You had no industry. You had all sectors of the population at war with the Bolsheviks. You had socialists at war with the Bolsheviks. You had Bolsheviks at war with the Bolsheviks. And the only way that they could deal with this is through violence. Create an army, give it a name, the food requisition army or whatever it is, and send it out to do this by force.